She was 14. Her name was Aissatou, and she was the only family Ibrahim Traoré had left. She disappeared on a Tuesday. No warning. No message. Just an empty chair and a scarf left behind on a dusty porch. They didn't ask for ransom. They didn't send a threat. Because this wasn't about money. This was a message. They thought if they could take her, they could control him. Silence him. Break him. But they forgot who they were dealing with. This wasn't a politician they'd snatched a family member from. This was a soldier. A survivor of coups, betrayals, and bullet storms. A man who had bled more than he had spoken. Ibrahim Traoré didn't scream. He didn't tweet. He didn't even flinch. He just stood still and started asking questions. Where was she last seen? What cars were around? Who left early? No panic. No drama. Just calm, calculating fury. But deep inside, something was burning. Because Aissatou wasn't just his sister. She was his anchor. The only human being who still called him Ibra like they were still kids. The only person who knew the boy beneath the uniform. And now she was gone. So he did what no president was ever trained to do. He disappeared. For 36 hours, no one knew where Traoré was. Not his cabinet. Not his commanders. Not even his closest security officers. What they didn't know was that Traoré wasn't missing. He was hunting. Traoré wasn't sitting behind a desk. He wasn't on a call with diplomats or drafting statements for the press. He was in the shadows. No convoy. No cameras. Just one plain vehicle, 2 loyal men, and a name, whispered by a street kid in Ouagadougou. White truck. Northern road. No plates. That was all he needed. By the time intelligence confirmed it, Traoré was already gone, boots in the dust, hands ready. Not as a president, but as a brother. What he found wasn't a hideout. It was a holding cell, disguised as a storage shed on the edge of a broken village. Inside, he saw things he'd only heard about in reports. Things that made hardened soldiers sick. Women with bruises. Boys with empty stares. And in the corner, a red scarf, folded on top of a rusted chair. Aissatou wasn't there, but her presence screamed louder than any voice. He walked in slow. Measured. Eyes like steel. There were 5 men. Relaxed. Laughing. They didn't know who he was. They didn't get a chance to find out. What happened next didn't last long. No shouting. No firefight. Just silence. And then the sound of cuffs clicking shut on the wrists of the last man still breathing. He didn't kill them. He wanted them to talk. And when they did, what he learned changed everything. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't personal. It was political. They hadn't taken his sister to control him. They'd taken her to provoke him. To bait him into lashing out. To justify something bigger. An international move to paint him as unstable, dangerous, unfit to lead. It was a trap. And they almost succeeded. Traoré didn't flinch. Because now he understood. They weren't just trying to break him. They were trying to paint him into a corner. A corner where the next bullet he fired wouldn't echo in silence. It would spark a narrative. African dictator goes rogue. Burkina Faso collapses under military rule. West Africa destabilized by emotional strongman. All headlines they were ready to print. All stories they had already drafted. All just waiting for him to snap. But Traoré didn't snap. He calculated. Instead of striking back, he stepped forward. He called a press conference. No military backdrop. No nationalistic shouting. Just a man in plain clothes. With his sister's scarf folded in his hand. And in front of the world, he said just one line. If they thought this would silence me, they've only reminded me why I speak. No rage. No threats. Just truth. The room was silent. Reporters couldn't tweet fast enough. Hashtags flooded timelines across continents. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traoré became something more than a soldier. More than a president. He became a mirror. To every leader who sold silence as stability. To every nation that built power on pain. To every citizen who'd forgotten that resistance doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it breathes. That same night, Traoré returned to the safe house where survivors were being treated. No cameras. No press. He walked to a quiet corner and finally saw her. Aïssatou. Eyes tired. Voice faint. But alive. The room was still. She didn't cry. She just looked at him and whispered, "You found me." He nodded once. Always. He didn't talk about what happened. Didn't mention the trap. Didn't tell her how close the world came to war. He just held her hand. Because some battles don't need speeches. Just presence. The next morning, Burkina Faso's streets were filled. Not with protests, not with military parades, but with people. Quiet crowds. Holding signs that read, "They took his sister. They tried to break him." But he stood taller. Traoré never released the names of the men responsible. Not because he forgave them, but because they weren't the real threat. The real enemy was the idea that black leadership must always be angry to be strong. That if you don't bend, you must break. And that power must always scream to be heard. He disproved all of it by doing none of it. No violence. No meltdown. Just resolve. And that's why the story didn't end with revenge. It ended with clarity. A brother found his sister. A country found its balance. And the world? The world found something it wasn't ready for. An African leader who doesn't flinch, doesn't fold, and doesn't need permission to protect what's his. Ibrahim Traoré.